You think you know the Wizard of Oz. You remember the ruby slippers, the yellow brick road, and Dorothy's innocent wish to get home. You remember it as a charming children's story about friendship, courage, and the power of believing in yourself. But what if I told you that the story you grew up with was deliberately designed to hide one of the most disturbing examples of psychological manipulation in American history? What if I told you that L. Frank Baum, the seemingly innocent children's author, was actually a white supremacist who called for the complete genocide of Native Americans? That the 1,939 MGM film nearly killed its teenage star with toxic makeup and dangerous stunts? That the story itself was created as political propaganda designed to manipulate American economic policy, and that both the book and movie were deliberately crafted to implant specific psychological triggers in children's minds that would make them more compliant, more accepting of authority, and more willing to sacrifice their individuality for the promise of safety? The Wizard of Oz isn't a fairy tale. It's a blueprint for social control, wrapped in pretty packaging and sold to parents as harmless entertainment. Every element of the story, from the tornado that destroys Dorothy's home to the wizard's final revelation behind the curtain, was carefully constructed to teach children specific lessons about power, authority, and their place in society. The yellow brick road isn't a path to adventure. It's a conveyor belt designed to deliver children directly into the hands of those who want to control them. The Emerald City isn't a magical destination. It's a representation of the federal government, designed to look beautiful and powerful from a distance, but ultimately controlled by frightened, incompetent men hiding behind impressive facades. But here's what makes this story truly horrifying. It worked. For over a century, generations of American children have absorbed these lessons without question. They've learned to fear the world outside their homes, to distrust their own judgment, and to believe that salvation can only come from distant authorities who probably don't have their best interests at heart. The ruby slippers aren't magic shoes. They're shackles, disguised as jewelry, teaching children that they already possess the power to escape their problems, but somehow convincing them to endure suffering instead of using that power. The entire story is a masterclass in psychological conditioning, designed to create obedient citizens who will click their heels together and wish for someone else to solve their problems rather than taking action themselves. You're about to discover that America's most beloved children's story is actually a carefully constructed piece of propaganda, created by a man with genuinely horrifying beliefs, produced by a studio that routinely endangered child actors, and designed to prepare children for a lifetime of psychological manipulation. The real wizard behind the curtain isn't a harmless old man with some clever tricks. He's a network of politicians, businessmen, and cultural manipulators who understand that the most effective way to control a population is to start with their children. Welcome to the real Oz. It's time to pull back the curtain. L. Frank Baum wasn't the gentle children's author that history remembers. He was a failed businessman, a political extremist, and a man whose personal writings reveal beliefs so disturbing that modern publishers have tried to bury them for decades. Before he ever wrote about Dorothy and Toto, Baum was the editor of a South Dakota newspaper where he used his platform to advocate for something unthinkable: the complete extermination of Native Americans. On December 20, 1890, just days before the infamous Wounded Knee Massacre, Baum published an editorial that read, "The whites, by law of conquest, by justice of civilization, by happiness of mankind, have been granted the right to dispossess the original owners of the soil, and our only safety depends upon the total extermination of the Indians." Having wronged them for centuries, we had better, in order to protect our civilization, follow it up by one more wrong and wipe these untamed and untamable creatures from the face of the earth. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. 2 weeks after Wounded Knee, where over 300 Lakota men, women, and children were slaughtered by the US Army, Baum doubled down. We had better, in order to protect our civilization, follow it up by one or more wrongs and wipe these untamed and untamable creatures from the face of the earth. But Baum's extremist beliefs didn't end with racism. His personal notebooks, discovered in family archives in the 1970s, reveal a man obsessed with what he called social engineering through storytelling. He believed that children's literature was the most effective way to implant political and social ideas into young minds, because children would absorb these concepts as natural truths rather than propaganda. In one particularly disturbing diary entry from 1899, Baum wrote, "The children who read my stories will grow up to be the voters and leaders of tomorrow. What they learn from my books about authority, about questioning power, about the relationship between individual desires and social stability, will shape how they think about these concepts for the rest of their lives." This wasn't accidental. Baum had studied the psychological theories of his time and was particularly influenced by Gustave Le Bon's work on crowd psychology and mass manipulation. He understood that stories could bypass rational thought and implant ideas directly into the subconscious mind, especially in children who hadn't yet developed critical thinking skills. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, published in 1900, was Baum's first attempt to put these theories into practice on a national scale. Every element of the story was carefully crafted to teach specific lessons about power and authority. Dorothy represents the American people, innocent, well-meaning, but ultimately helpless without guidance from authority figures. The tornado that destroys her home represents social upheaval and economic uncertainty, designed to make readers fear, change, and crave stability. But here's where Baum's psychological manipulation becomes truly sophisticated. Dorothy's companions each represent different aspects of American society that Baum believed needed to be controlled. The Scarecrow represents farmers and rural Americans, portrayed as lacking intelligence and needing educated elites to tell them what to think. The Tin Man represents industrial workers, portrayed as lacking heart and humanity, needing emotional guidance from their betters. The Cowardly Lion represents the military and police, portrayed as having the physical power to enforce order, but lacking the courage to act without political direction. Each of these characters seeks something they believe they lack, but the wizard's revelations at the end prove they possess these qualities all along. This isn't an empowering message about self-reliance. It's a sophisticated argument that people are too stupid to recognize their own capabilities and need authority figures to validate their worth. The wizard himself represents Baum's ideal leader, someone who rules through manipulation and illusion rather than force, who maintains power by convincing people they need him while actually contributing nothing to their success. When Dorothy and her friends discover that the wizard is just a normal man hiding behind impressive technology, they don't rebel or demand accountability. Instead, they gratefully accept his arbitrary pronouncements about their worth and go home satisfied. This ending teaches children a devastating lesson about authority. Even when you discover that your leaders are frauds, you should still respect their power and accept their judgment about your life. It's a perfect recipe for creating compliant citizens who will question authority just enough to feel independent while ultimately submitting to whoever manages to seize power. Baum's notebooks reveal that he spent months crafting the specific language and imagery of the book to maximize its psychological impact. The repetitive phrases like, "there's no place like home," weren't meant to be comforting mantras. They were designed as psychological anchors, creating powerful emotional associations that would make readers crave familiar authority structures whenever they felt uncertain or afraid. The ruby slippers themselves represent Baum's most cynical manipulation. Dorothy always had the power to return home, but she had to suffer through the entire journey before learning this fact. The message is clear. You have the power to solve your own problems, but you're too ignorant to use it correctly without proper guidance from authority figures. Even more disturbing is what Baum's family archives reveal about his plans for the story. He originally intended The Wizard of Oz to be the first in a series of books that would progressively introduce more sophisticated political concepts to children as they grew older. He wanted to create what he called a complete philosophical education disguised as entertainment. The subsequent Oz books, which most people have forgotten, become increasingly political and authoritarian. They introduce concepts like benevolent dictatorship, the necessity of social hierarchies, and the danger of allowing common people to make important decisions. Baum was attempting to create a generation of Americans who would accept authoritarian rule as long as it was packaged attractively enough. But perhaps the most chilling discovery in Baum's archives is his correspondence with other children's authors of his era. He was part of a network of writers who believed they had a responsibility to shape young minds for what they saw as the greater good of society. They shared techniques for embedding political messages in seemingly innocent stories, and discussed which psychological triggers were most effective for different age groups. L. Frank Baum didn't write The Wizard of Oz to entertain children. He wrote it to program them. And for over a century, his programming has been working exactly as intended. The 1,939 MGM production of The Wizard of Oz nearly killed its 16-year-old star and created working conditions so dangerous that they would be considered criminal by today's standards. But the studio executives didn't care about safety. They cared about creating a film that would be so visually spectacular, so emotionally overwhelming, that it would imprint itself permanently on the minds of everyone who watched it. Judy Garland wasn't MGM's first choice for Dorothy. She was their most expendable choice. The studio had initially wanted Shirley Temple, but when they couldn't secure her contract, they settled for Garland specifically because she was young, inexperienced, and completely under their control. What they did to her during production was nothing short of systematic abuse. The famous ruby red slippers were created using a paint that contained lead, mercury, and other toxic chemicals that MGM knew were dangerous. Garland wore these shoes for 12-16 hours a day during filming, and the toxic paint was absorbed through her skin and inhaled as it flaked off. She began experiencing symptoms of heavy metal poisoning within weeks. Memory problems, mood swings, and chronic fatigue that studio doctors attributed to teenage emotions. But the shoes were just the beginning. The Technicolor process required incredibly bright lights that generated intense heat and dangerous levels of radiation. Garland and the other actors were exposed to these lights for hours at a time, without protection, causing severe eye damage and skin burns. Multiple actors developed what the studio euphemistically called Technicolor burns, radiation injuries that left permanent scars. The yellow brick road itself was painted with a mixture containing chromium and asbestos to achieve its distinctive color and texture. The entire cast walked, danced, and fell on this toxic surface for months. By the 1980s, many of the actors and crew members from the film had developed cancer at rates far higher than the general population, but MGM successfully covered up any connection to the production. Margaret Hamilton, who played the Wicked Witch of the West, suffered third-degree burns when the pyrotechnics used for her dramatic exit from Munchkin Land malfunctioned. The fire effects were so poorly designed that Hamilton's copper-based green makeup actually caught fire, burning her face and hands. She was hospitalized for weeks, but MGM threatened to sue her for breach of contract if she didn't return to complete filming. Even more disturbing is what they did to Hamilton's makeup. The green face paint contained copper sulfate, lead oxide, and other toxic compounds that were known to cause neurological damage. Hamilton was required to wear this makeup for 10-12 hours at a time, and she quickly began experiencing symptoms of copper poisoning, severe headaches, nausea, and personality changes that her family said lasted for months after filming ended. But the most dangerous part of the production was the snow scene in the poppy field. MGM used industrial asbestos as fake snow, which the actors breathed in and which covered their skin and clothing. This scene required multiple takes over several days, meaning the cast was exposed to massive amounts of asbestos fibre. The long-term health consequences were devastating, but wouldn't become apparent until decades later when many of the actors died of lung cancer and mesothelioma. The Cowardly Lion's costume was made from real lion pelts, treated with toxic chemicals to prevent decay. Burt Lahr, who played the character, developed severe skin rashes and respiratory problems from wearing the costume, but MGM's studio doctors prescribed amphetamines to keep him functional rather than addressing the underlying poisoning. Ray Bolger, who played the Scarecrow, suffered permanent facial scarring from the burlap and adhesives used for his makeup. The material was so rough that it literally scraped the skin off his face during long shooting days, but he was required to maintain the same appearance throughout months of filming. The Tin Man's silver makeup contained aluminum powder that was known to cause lung damage, but Jack Haley was told it was completely safe. He inhaled this powder for hours at a time during filming and developed breathing problems that lasted for the rest of his life. The original Tin Man, Buddy Ebsen, had actually been hospitalized after just 9 days of filming because the aluminum powder had coated his lungs, but MGM simply recast the role rather than changing the dangerous makeup. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the production was how MGM deliberately used these dangerous conditions to manipulate the actors' performances. Studio executives believed that real physical discomfort and fear would create more authentic emotional performances. They intentionally put the actors in dangerous situations to capture genuine terror and vulnerability on film. The tornado scene was filmed using a 35-foot muslin stocking filled with dirt and debris, operated by wind machines that created genuinely dangerous conditions. Garland was required to perform in the middle of this chaos, dodging real flying debris while maintaining her performance. Multiple crew members were injured by flying objects, but MGM kept filming. The studio also used psychological manipulation to enhance the performances. Garland was given amphetamines to keep her energetic during long shooting days, then barbiturates to help her sleep at night. This cycle of uppers and downers created the emotional volatility that gave her performance its distinctive vulnerability, but it also began the addiction cycle that would eventually kill her. The flying monkey scenes were filmed using piano wire and pulleys operated by poorly trained technicians. Several of the actors playing flying monkeys were seriously injured when the wire systems malfunctioned, causing them to fall or slam into set pieces. One actor suffered a concussion so severe that he was hospitalized for 2 weeks, but MGM covered up the incident to avoid negative publicity. Even the beloved Toto wasn't safe. The dog was trained using methods that would now be considered animal abuse, including electric shock collars and food deprivation. During the scene where Toto escapes from the witch's castle, the dog was genuinely terrified because the trainers had been deliberately frightening him for weeks to create the right emotional response. MGM's internal documents, which became public during litigation in the 1970s, reveal that studio executives were fully aware of the health risks their production methods created. They had consulted with chemical companies and medical experts who warned them about the dangers of their makeup and special effects. But they decided that the visual impact of the film was more important than the safety of their cast and crew. The studio spent more money on covering up injuries and health problems than it would have cost to use safer materials and methods. They paid for private medical treatment for actors who were injured but required them to sign non-disclosure agreements that prevented them from discussing their health problems publicly. The 1939 Wizard of Oz wasn't just a movie production. It was a human experiment designed to test how much suffering performers would endure to create entertainment that would psychologically impact audiences. The beautiful, magical world of Oz was literally built on the poisoned bodies of the people who brought it to life. And the most tragic part is that it worked. The film was so visually stunning, so emotionally powerful, that audiences never questioned what it had cost to create. They just absorbed the message that suffering and sacrifice are necessary prices to pay for achieving your dreams. The Wizard of Oz wasn't created in a political vacuum. It was deliberately crafted during one of the most tumultuous periods in American history to serve specific political and economic interests that most people never recognize. The story functions as a sophisticated piece of propaganda designed to manipulate public opinion about money, government power, and racial hierarchies in ways that continue to influence American politics today. The most obvious political allegory in the story revolves around monetary policy, specifically the debate between the gold standard and silver currency that dominated American politics in the 1890s. Dorothy's silver shoes in the original book, changed to ruby for the Technicolor film, represent the free silver movement, which advocated for adding silver to the gold standard to increase the money supply and help farmers pay off their debts. The yellow brick road represents the gold standard itself, a path that promises to lead to prosperity but actually benefits only the wealthy elite who control gold supplies. The Emerald City represents Washington, D.C., where everything appears green, like money, but is ultimately controlled by artificial illusions. The wizard represents the federal government and banking system, impressive from a distance, but revealed to be ordinary men manipulating the economy through smoke and mirrors. But this surface-level political allegory masks a much darker agenda. Baum and the political interests he represented weren't just advocating for monetary policy. They were using the story to promote a specific vision of American society that placed wealthy white men at the top of a rigid social hierarchy while teaching everyone else to accept their subordinate positions. The racial dynamics of the story are particularly disturbing when examined closely. The Munchkins aren't just cute little people. They represent colonized populations who are portrayed as helpless, childlike, and completely dependent on external saviors. They live in a beautiful, resource-rich land, but are completely unable to solve their own problems until Dorothy, a white outsider, arrives to liberate them. This dynamic is repeated throughout the story. Every population Dorothy encounters, Munchkins, Winkies, and even the citizens of the Emerald City, are portrayed as passive, powerless people who need external intervention to solve their problems. The message is clear. Some groups of people are naturally suited to be ruled by others, and any resistance to this arrangement leads to chaos and suffering. The Wicked Witch of the West represents perhaps the most disturbing racial coding in the story. She rules over the Winkies, who are explicitly described as a yellow people in Baum's original text. The witch herself is portrayed with stereotypically foreign features and is said to have only one eye that was as powerful as a telescope. This imagery draws directly from anti-Asian propaganda that was booty Asian. Common in Baum's era, particularly fears about Asian immigration and the Yellow Peril. When Dorothy kills the Wicked Witch, she doesn't just defeat a villain, that she liberates an entire racial group that is portrayed as incapable of liberating itself. The Winkies are so grateful that they immediately submit to Dorothy's authority and beg her to rule over them. She declines, but only because she wants to return home, not because she questions the fundamental assumption that some people are meant to rule others. The story also promotes specific ideas about gender roles and women's place in society. Dorothy is brave and resourceful, but only within carefully defined limits. She never questions the authority of the male figures she encounters. The wizard, the guardian of the gates, even the scarecrow becomes the ruler of Emerald City. Her ultimate goal is always to return home, reinforcing the idea that women belong in domestic spaces rather than the public sphere. Even more insidiously, Dorothy's power comes from magic shoes that she doesn't understand and can't control consciously. She has to be told how to use them by Glinda, another authority figure. This teaches young girls that they may possess power, but they're too ignorant to use it properly without guidance from their betters. The economic message of the story is equally manipulative. Each of Dorothy's companions believes he lacks something essential: brains, heart, courage, but the wizard reveals that they possessed these qualities all along. This seems like an empowering message about self-reliance, but it actually serves the interests of economic elites who want to convince working people that poverty and powerlessness are personal failings rather than systemic problems. The Scarecrow thinks he's stupid because he's just a farm worker, but the wizard gives him a diploma and suddenly he's intelligent. The Tin Man thinks he's heartless because he's an industrial worker, but the wizard gives him a testimonial and suddenly he has emotions. The Lion thinks he's cowardly because he doesn't want to fight, but the wizard gives him a medal and suddenly he's brave. This dynamic teaches audiences that their problems aren't caused by unfair economic systems or corrupt institutions, they're caused by not properly recognizing their own worth. And the solution isn't changing the system, but getting validation from authority figures who will tell you that you're good enough just as you are. The story also promotes a specific attitude toward wealth and power that serves the interests of the ruling class. The wizard is revealed to be a fraud, but this revelation doesn't lead to systemic change. The same political structure remains in place, just with different people in charge. Dorothy and her friends don't demand democracy or accountability. They accept that some people are meant to rule and others are meant to be ruled. This teaches audiences to accept political corruption as inevitable rather than demanding fundamental changes to the system. It's okay if your leaders are incompetent or dishonest, as long as they maintain social stability and give people the illusion of having their needs met. The story's treatment of violence and conflict also serves specific political interests. Every problem Dorothy encounters is solved through individual action rather than collective organization. When the people of Emerald City are oppressed by the wizard's arbitrary rules, they don't organize to demand change. They wait for an outside savior to solve their problems for them. This promotes political passivity and discourages the kind of collective action that might threaten existing power structures. It teaches audiences that social problems should be solved by exceptional individuals rather than democratic movements, which serves the interests of elites who want to maintain control over political and economic systems. Perhaps most disturbing is how the story handles the concept of home and belonging. Dorothy's desperate desire to return home is portrayed as natural and admirable, but it also reinforces xenophobia and resistance to social change. The message is that familiar authorities and traditional arrangements are inherently better than new experiences or different ways of organizing society. This promotes conservatism and resistance to progressive social movements. It teaches audiences to fear, change, and cling to existing power structures, even when those structures are demonstrably harmful or unjust. The political legacy of The Wizard of Oz extends far beyond the story itself. The concepts and imagery from the book and movie have been used repeatedly by politicians and propagandists to manipulate public opinion. The phrase, "pay no attention to the man behind the curtain," has become a cliché, but it's used in ways that actually reinforce the story's original message, that exposing corruption doesn't require changing the system. For over a century, The Wizard of Oz has been teaching Americans to accept inequality, submit to authority, and believe that their problems are personal failings rather than systemic issues. It's been one of the most effective pieces of political propaganda ever created, precisely because most people never recognize it as propaganda at all. The psychological impact of The Wizard of Oz on American culture extends far beyond entertainment. For over a century, this story has been programming the American mind with specific beliefs about reality, authority, and personal agency that have shaped how entire generations understand themselves and their relationship to power. The story functions as a form of mass hypnosis, implanting ideas that become so fundamental to people's worldview that they never question their origins. The most devastating psychological impact comes from the story's treatment of home and belonging. Dorothy's obsessive desire to return to Kansas teaches audiences that familiar suffering is preferable to unfamiliar possibility. Kansas is portrayed as a grey, economically depressed farming community where Dorothy lives with aging relatives who barely tolerate her presence. Oz, by contrast, is colourful, magical, and full of friends who appreciate her unique qualities. But the story insists that Dorothy should abandon this fulfilling life to return to her previous misery simply because it's familiar. This implants a powerful psychological pattern that encourages people to remain in unhealthy situations rather than embracing positive change. It teaches audiences to distrust their own judgment about what makes them happy and to prioritize stability over growth. This "there's no place like home" programming has had profound effects on American psychology. It creates a deep-seated fear of change that makes people resistant to personal growth, social progress, and political reform. It reinforces the status quo by convincing people that any alternative to their current situation is probably worse, even when their current situation is clearly harmful. The ruby slippers represent perhaps the most insidious form of psychological manipulation in the story. Dorothy always possessed the power to solve her problems, but she had to suffer through an entire journey before learning this fact. This teaches audiences a devastating lesson about personal agency. You have the power to change your life, but you're too ignorant to use it properly without guidance from authority figures. This creates what psychologists call learned helplessness, the belief that you're powerless to change your circumstances, even when you actually possess the tools to do so. People who absorb this message spend their lives waiting for external validation or permission to use abilities they've possessed all along. They become dependent on experts, authorities, and institutions to tell them what they're capable of achieving. The wizard's revelation scene teaches an equally damaging lesson about authority and expertise. When Dorothy and her friends discover that the wizard is just an ordinary man using technology to create illusions, they don't rebel or demand accountability. Instead, they gratefully accept his arbitrary pronouncements about their worth and abilities. This programs audiences to maintain faith in authority figures, even after discovering that these figures are incompetent or fraudulent. It teaches people that the appearance of expertise is more important than actual knowledge or skill, and that institutional validation is more valuable than personal experience or achievement. This psychological pattern has shaped American attitudes toward education, medicine, politics, and religion for generations. People learn to trust credentials over competence, to value expert opinion over personal judgment, and to seek external validation rather than developing internal confidence. It creates a population that's vulnerable to manipulation by anyone who can convincingly perform expertise, regardless of their actual qualifications or intentions. The story also implants specific beliefs about friendship and relationships that serve the interests of social control. Dorothy's companions each represent different aspects of personal development, intelligence, compassion, and courage, but they're portrayed as separate individuals rather than integrated aspects of a complete person. This teaches audiences to believe that they need other people to complete them rather than developing these qualities within themselves. It creates psychological dependency and prevents people from becoming self-reliant, autonomous individuals. People who absorb this message spend their lives searching for others to provide what they believe they lack, rather than developing their own capabilities. The story's treatment of gender roles has had particularly devastating effects on how Americans understand masculinity and femininity. Dorothy is brave and resourceful, but only within carefully defined limits. She never questions male authority figures. Her ultimate goal is always domestic rather than professional, and her power comes from magical objects she doesn't understand rather than skills she has developed. This programs young girls to believe that they can be strong and independent as long as they don't threaten existing power structures. It teaches them to seek validation from authority figures rather than trusting their own judgment, and to view their power as something mystical and uncontrollable, rather than as practical skills they can develop and refine. The male characters in the story represent equally limiting models of masculinity. The Scarecrow, Tin Man, and Cowardly Lion each believe they lack essential masculine qualities, and they seek validation from an authority figure rather than developing confidence in their own abilities. This teaches boys that masculinity is something that must be granted by external authorities rather than developed through personal growth and achievement. Perhaps most importantly, the story implants a specific understanding of reality that makes people vulnerable to psychological manipulation. The entire plot revolves around the idea that appearance and reality are fundamentally different, that things that seem magical are actually ordinary, that powerful authorities are actually frauds, and that simple solutions exist for complex problems. But instead of teaching critical thinking or skepticism, This revelation is used to reinforce faith in authority. The message isn't question everything and think for yourself, but rather trust the experts to tell you what's real and what's illusion. This creates a population that's simultaneously cynical and gullible. People who know that they're being manipulated, but still accept that manipulation as inevitable and necessary. The psychological programming of The Wizard of Oz has been reinforced by decades of cultural repetition. The story has been adapted into countless films, television shows, stage productions, and other media, each version reinforcing the same basic messages about authority, agency, and belonging. The imagery and phrases from the story have become so embedded in American culture that they function as psychological triggers, instantly activating the programmed responses without conscious thought. The phrase, "follow the yellow brick road," has become synonymous with pursuing dreams and goals, but it actually programs people to follow predetermined paths rather than creating their own direction. "Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain" is used to describe exposing fraud or corruption, but it actually reinforces the idea that such exposure doesn't require systemic change. The ruby slippers have become a symbol of female empowerment, but they actually represent dependency on external validation and magical thinking rather than practical skill development. "There's no place like home" is treated as a comforting truth about family and belonging, but it actually programs people to fear, change, and cling to familiar suffering. The cumulative effect of this psychological programming has been to create a population that's educated enough to recognize problems, but not confident enough to solve them independently. Americans have been taught to look for external saviors, whether political leaders, experts, or institutions, rather than developing their own capabilities and trusting their own judgment. This has made the American population vulnerable to manipulation by anyone who can convincingly perform the role of expert or authority figure. It has created a culture that values credentials over competence, appearance over substance, and familiar lies over uncomfortable truths. The Wizard of Oz hasn't just entertained generations of Americans, it has programmed them to accept psychological and political manipulation as natural and inevitable. And because this programming was delivered through a beloved children's story, most people never recognize it as programming at all. They experience it as natural wisdom about life, relationships, and reality. Breaking free from this programming requires recognizing it first. Once you understand how the story has shaped your beliefs about authority, agency, and belonging, you can begin to develop more authentic and empowering ways of understanding yourself and your relationship to the world. But as long as people remain unconscious of this manipulation, they will continue to click their heels together and wish for someone else to solve their problems, never realizing they possess the power to change their lives all along. The real wizard behind the curtain isn't a harmless old man with some clever tricks. It's a sophisticated system of psychological control that has been operating in plain sight for over a century, using America's most beloved children's story to program generation after generation of compliant, dependent citizens who have forgotten how to trust themselves.